When Feiyu sent this gimbal out to me, I was actually very overwhelmed by the sheer number of items that it came with. The box that came in was just filled with accessories. Fortunately, what that means is with all these accessories, it will allow you to do a lot of things with your gimbal, including this, which is pretty darn cool. But before we get too carried away by this, let me just quickly summarize what it comes with. Unboxing it, you get a carrying case and an additional box for accessories, and obviously in the carrying case is the gimbal itself and all 4 of the lithium-ion batteries that you will need to power it. The charger for those batteries is also included, and it charges via micro USB, which I quite like in the name of convenience. And there's also a tripod base, a carbon fiber extension rod for extending the handle, and a special bracket for allowing you to attach an additional handle. There's a quick release plate, and there's also a lens support bracket, and just about every variant of USB cables for connecting your camera to the gimbal. And in the accessory box, there's also the focusing motor with a rod and a cable, and there's also a rubber lens gear for gearing up your ungeared lens. And you have the remote control unit. And I almost forgot to mention, this gimbal is called the FeiyuTech AK4500. Now the carrying case for the gimbal is made from foam, but it's not your average kind of foam. It's like a special strong kind of foam that doesn't just scratch off like your typical polystyrene box, and being foam, it also means it's very light. It's actually essentially similar to the kind of box the DJI Ronin comes in, if you've ever seen one of those before. But like most gimbal carrying cases, you can't really fit the gimbal back inside the box once you've actually balanced the camera on it, because you've moved things around so it doesn't quite fit back into those little cutouts. So you would have to undo all the balancing that you've done just to be able to fit it back inside the case, to be able to transport it in the case, just to repeat the whole balancing process all over again the next time you use it. The AK4500 was designed to be used with DSLR and mirrorless cameras, so here I'm using a Canon EOS R, and as long as you have a reasonable lens attached, for example not a 70-200 on a gimbal, it's going to balance and operate just fine. Its maximum payload is 4.6 kilograms, which I think is quite adequate for a gimbal of this range. I was even able to balance my Canon C100 Mark II on it with a modified base plate. Although you can kind of argue that the C100 Mark II is a mirrorless camera, right? But anyway, this is a very easy gimbal to balance. So here I'm powering it down because it has a locking switch for each and every axis. So here I can lock the whole gimbal down, so it's locked on, and I can balance it axis by axis. So I unlock one axis, balance that axis, unlock the next, and move on to balancing that axis, and so on. There's also a 2-stage quick release plate. So here on the bottom is the sliding plate that actually allows you to slide the camera back and forth for balancing it. But here's the attachment plate that actually goes onto the camera, which means I can unmount the camera from the gimbal without ever changing the position of the sliding plate, which means my balance is going to remain intact when I put the camera back on the gimbal. If I could just get this damn thing to click in. Let's try that again. So I'm going to put the camera back onto the gimbal. Hopefully it doesn't jam this time. There we go. Perfectly balanced, like all things should be. And not to mention the feet that it comes with is very useful for the balancing process as well, for obvious reasons. But you can also close it down and it will become an extension of the handle, so you can actually fit 2 hands on it, or if you don't like it, you can just unscrew it and remove it altogether. There. Operating this gimbal in terms of accessing its user interface is actually very user-friendly because it has a touchscreen as opposed to some other gimbals I've used that literally only have buttons and LEDs. This is so much better. On this one, you literally just swipe and tap to change settings. And being a gimbal, its one job is to stabilize your motion, and I would say this particular gimbal does a pretty darn good job at just that. Even when I was dashing down a corridor running, it did a great job of giving me a nice and smooth shot, and it's quite natural in terms of how the motion looks. The panning motion does feel rather organic and doesn't quite come across as jarring as would be the case with some gimbals. And there are 4 follow modes on this gimbal. So the first of which is kind of like a chicken head mode. No matter how you move the gimbal, it's going to try and keep the camera in the same orientation. The second one is just a pan follow mode. The third mode is both pan and tilt. And the fourth follow mode is an all follow mode that will simply follow your movement in every direction. So there's also a customizable control knob here on the gimbal. So here I have it set to control the tilt of my camera, but you can also have it control other things like the focus when you do have the focus motor attached. And I do quite enjoy using this knob because it is quite responsive. And with this attachment, you can add an additional handle to your gimbal, which I will do in just a minute. So we're attaching the remote control unit as the additional handle. So there we have it. Not only do we have an extra point of support for the gimbal now, it also works exceptionally well as a top handle for operating the gimbal in low mode. But my main issue with this is because the main handle is so long, it does stick out quite a bit, and when you're running about in low mode, there is a very high tendency that you will end up kicking this part of the gimbal. There's also a vertical mode on this gimbal for, I guess, shooting for your Instagram story. I don't know, not gonna judge. But there's also some rather bizarre modes like a 360 rotation mode that was referenced in the user manual as Inception mode, which I guess is a reference to the corridor scene in Nolan's Inception. But basically what it does is it spins your camera round and round like this, and the outcome looks sort of like this. I personally think it's a bit over the top for my taste, but some people might enjoy using this mode. But there are some modes that I really do quite appreciate. For example, time-lapse mode. And in time-lapse mode, not only will your gimbal turn into an intervalometer for your camera when you hook it up to your camera via USB, you can also set a start and end point, and the gimbal will slowly execute that move throughout the duration of your time-lapse. Which means with this, you can have a panning or tilting movement in your time-lapse, which I find to be really neat because it certainly is something that adds value. You can even set it to have the motion momentarily freeze every single time a shot is being fired, which makes it viable to be used with long exposure time-lapses as well. Now let's talk about this guy. This is the remote control unit for the gimbal, and the product name that FeiyuTech's given this controller is the Hyperlink controller. Now, in my opinion, this controller is the selling point of the AK4500 gimbal. On some other gimbals, they rely on using your smartphone as its controller, like the recently announced DJI Ronin SC. Now, I personally enjoy having a controller that is not my smartphone. Now, not hogging my phone is one thing, but ergonomics is another thing for me. This thing has a knob and a joystick, and it feels so much more intuitive and tactile than operating it on a touchscreen. You only have to pair this to the gimbal once for the first time, and it auto-connects every other time you use it. This thing has a built-in non-removable battery, and it charges through USB Type-C. The layout on the remote unit basically mirrors the layout on the gimbal's grip, except on the remote unit, the OLED display is tiny and doesn't display as much info as the bigger one on the gimbal grip. And on the remote, you can only toggle between the first 2 out of the 4 follow modes on the gimbal. And one minor disappointment is that I found the knob on the remote control unit a tad less responsive than the actual knob on the gimbal itself. But also from the Hyperlink controller is arguably what's the most exciting feature on the AK4500 gimbal, and that is the wireless motion control mode. Now that is activated by pressing in a button on the back of the Hyperlink controller, but you do have to keep your finger on the button for the follow to remain active, so it kind of works like a dead man's switch. I do wish that there was at least an option to be able to slide the switch down into a position to be able to lock it down. Do note that this will only pick up panning and tilting movements, so it's a 2-axis remote, plus there is a fair amount of delay when operating it, so there's definitely a bit of a learning curve and you do have to take some time to get used to it. But overall, I would say that this function works quite well. And of course, when you have the wireless focus motor set up on the gimbal, you can use this as a wireless focus pulling unit as well. The motor is powered directly from the gimbal over the same USB port that also controls it. The only thing I don't like about attaching the focus motor is that you have to use a hex key to do it. Granted, they do include one, but I do wish that it could have been a toolless setup. There is also a mobile companion app for the gimbal called the Feiyu On app, although I personally find the app to be completely optional because there's nothing I find that I can do on the app that I can't do on the actual gimbal, with the exception of software updates. Which brings me to my final thoughts on this gimbal. I find this gimbal to be a very wholesome gimbal, and it's a very complete package. I think it's a very well made gimbal, both in terms of product design and also build quality, but for a price tag of $749, quite frankly, I wouldn't be expecting anything less. And that sums up the review. If you're interested in getting this gimbal, I'll leave some links down below where you can get them from. Leave any questions or comments you may have. And if you enjoyed the review, do consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon for more videos just like this. And I will see you in the next video. But until then, here's another video of mine YouTube things you should watch. Or if you don't like a computer algorithm telling you what to watch, here's one of my latest videos.